Africa is a vast and diverse continent. It has often been debated whether Africa has a history of its own, as much of it is unwritten. It is common for people to doubt African history, even when presented with archaeological and documentary evidence. No one questions the history of Europe or America, but the history of Africa remains a matter of doubt for many. Nicolas Sarkozy said that the African man has not entered history enough, reflecting a mistaken perception that many still hold. François-Xavier Fauvel argues that this denial is related to a racist ideology developed during the modern European era. It was used to justify the slave trade, in which slaves were bought in Africa and transported across the Atlantic. Africa has a rich history, but having a history is often confused with having written it. Africa's history is complex and vast. The continent has 54 or 55 countries today, but there used to be many more, including large empires and small kingdoms. African history has been adulterated and reconstructed and is not adequately taught in schools or the media. What is shown in the media are stereotypes of war, famine, corruption, and disease, giving a biased image of the continent. The term, Black Africa, is a colonial legacy that describes the inhabitants by their skin color. Recently, the term, Sub-Saharan Africa, has been adopted, although not all countries are located south of the Sahara. The term, pre-colonial Africa, is also inaccurate, as most African regions were not colonized until very recently. Africa has the oldest history of humanity, and what Europeans have discovered and built is their own version of Africa. The intensified black slave trade in the 18th century is one of the reasons why African history is marginalized. This trade, directed towards the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, was encouraged by Muslim Arabs from the 9th century. The skin color of slaves was the main excuse to justify the Atlantic slave trade. During the 18th century, being an Atlantic slave was synonymous with being black. Research on Africa has come mostly from colonial anthropologists and ethnologists. Africa is a vast continent, with 30 million square kilometers and 54 states, 5 Mediterranean and 49 sub-Saharan. Africa is not a homogeneous entity, let alone a country or state. The continent's social and linguistic diversity is immense, encompassing every possible climate. Until independence, knowledge of Africa was reserved for anthropologists, especially French ones. Since 1990, historical work has increasingly been led by African historians. There is a lack of diversity and economic resources for historical research in Africa. There are historical concepts about Africa that need to be revised, such as the idea of redelimiting borders. It was decided to respect colonial boundaries to avoid border conflicts between African states. The real problem is how to prevent the largest ethnic groups from controlling power. The dominant ideology in Africa is based on individualism, which makes change difficult. It has been argued that Africa's current ills have their origins in slavery and colonization. In 2001, at the World Conference Against Racism, reparations were demanded from the former European slave states. Slavery was not introduced to Africa by Europeans, as it existed long before. In fact, some Africans sold their own brothers to European slave traders. This truth began to be recognized in late 1998. The slave trade was an internal operation on the continent before reaching the coast. From the interior to the coast, distribution and markets enriched some parts of Africa by selling to others. The resolution of African problems requires recognizing the specificities of the continent. Recognition of ethnic foundations is essential for African reconstruction. African crises have historical, political, and cultural origins, not just economic ones. Before being Francophones or Anglophones, Africans are, above all, Africans with their own languages and beliefs.